Do you think Trump could give them access to the Patriots? What would Putin make of that? Or it doesn't make a difference what Trump does?
I suspect that doesn't really make a difference. I mean, absolutely, I think Trump's attitudes are changing. And in part, it's because Trump essentially likes winners. Frankly, this extraordinarily foolish Gulf War has led to such a patriot hunger for the interceptor missiles that restocking American supplies and also the magazines of America's allies in the Gulf, for whom they essentially regard this as a necessary demand for continued sort of willingness to work with Washington, means that actually there's not going to be many patriots around for quite some time to come. Unfortunately, I just think that's just not going to be feasible. He's not, I think, going to step in and say, well, we're not going to let the Israelis have it anymore.
This is The Global Gambit.
Now, I know you're not an economist, so I'm gonna frame the question from a way that ensures it's related to your focus. But you know, when Putin is threatening to cut the pensions, or when there is this idea that public services are having to be severely cut in parts of the rural oblasts, when state salaries to try and get signing bonuses and all this are being pushed, and yet it seems very difficult to know where that money's going to come from. Surely there's a limited time frame that you can keep those sorts of policies in place before you have to, I don't know, cut elsewhere or I don't know, restructure the whole thing in a significant way, which will start making people notice more.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, people are noticing. There's no way of getting around that fact. You know, when 40% of your average person's budget is going on food, when you can't get a mortgage because the interest rates remain too high, or your existing mortgage is proving crippling, and there's high levels of foreclosures and the like. You know, all of these factors, people of course are noticing. But again, there is this question of, well, what do you do about it? You know, protest is a very dangerous thing. This is still a thuggish police state, and also it's a time of war. I mean, I don't get the sense that the majority of Russians wanted this war in the first place and are particularly supportive of it. And whenever we see these opinion polls, they tend to show that, you know, a substantial majority would rather negotiations and continued conflict. Now, negotiations, we have to treat that with caution, because it doesn't mean we should negotiate everything and pull out of the occupied territories. I think they more or less mean we should just basically end the war. I think that's what they mean by negotiations, and then talk about how we actually sort of resolve that. But the point is that at the same time, just as with the elite, actually doing something about it is a very dangerous thing. And do you accept that times are getting harder, but hope that it doesn't last for too long and then you have a rebound? Remember, you know, actually 2023 and 2024 saw people's quality of lives increase artificially because of high levels of defense spending, but nonetheless, people had more money in their pocket and were spending more. So it's not like they're yet at a point where they think it's been 10 years now and nothing is getting better. So there is still room for a little bit of optimism. And I think that's the point. That's what the Kremlin is gambling on. The Kremlin is gambling on the fact that this war will not go on forever. Quite the opposite, that they basically reckon that maybe I think that there is a certain perspective amongst a certain proportion of people in the Kremlin who genuinely believe that by the end of this year, they will have taken the last bits of Donbass, the remaining 20 or so % of Donetsk Oblast, which gives them the opportunity to basically declare a win and sort of more or less try and fix the end to the war. Perhaps after another winter of hammering the Ukrainians' energy supply system and infrastructure, in the hope that that makes them a little bit more amenable. Now, if you genuinely believe that, and to be honest, I think a lot of this is whistling in the wind, it's over-optimism, but the point is, if that's what you actually believe or have convinced yourself, you can think, well, we can handle this for another year, because then suddenly we'll say, hey, the war is over, and people will be more optimistic then, and we will be able to divert a little bit of extra resource towards dealing with the needs of the people. Hopefully we'll start to see some kind of sanctions relief. And so it goes. You know, I think we should never underestimate the capacity of people to double down, convinced that actually this time the roulette wheel will throw up the right number.
Interesting. All right. So you mentioned about the people and how their sentiment is. But do we actually have a sense of how people feel about Putin? Things like the Levada Center or any reasonable organization that might have given us slightly less interfered with number, I think have all been shut down or severely censored at this point. But a lot of people emphasize that, yes, a lot of Russians perhaps are opposed to this war, but a lot of very pro-Ukrainian voices will argue that most Russians are pro it because they haven't done enough to stop it. But I think that shows an a misunderstanding or lack of understanding of just how entrenched the system is and the risks that are associated with showing any resistance. Where do you sit on this sort of debate?
Yeah, I mean, it is exceedingly difficult to know quite what the Russians are feeling and thinking. And therefore, yes, there is this scope for everyone to decide what they actually think. I must admit, I am, like you, very skeptical about the idea that we can say that the Russians are supportive of this war because they're not protesting in large enough numbers. This is, as I say, a thuggish police state in which what you do doesn't just simply potentially have terrible impact on you, but also on your family. And I think, again, people will generally be making assessments based on whether they think the protest is going to lead anywhere. If it's just futile, and I think this is one of the successes of the regime, is to convince people the protest is futile, then what's the point? You just focus on just looking after yourself and your family. And there is also, I think it's worth noting, a considerable degree of just natural patriotism. You may not have wanted this war, but if your country is in a war, you'd rather it win the war rather than lose it. And that is a reason, or for some people, a pretext for not protesting right now. You think, well, look, we're all in this together. Let's just kind of see what happens. All that said, yeah, I mean, I think that it's very hard to trust any of the actual opinion polling data that we do still have. If only we had access to the opinion polling data that the Kremlin has, because government is still the single largest consumer of Russian polling data. But on the other hand, we can see trends. There's this odd thing about Putin's sky-high approval ratings. I mean, it was once in the 80%. Now, clearly, it has fallen. According to some, it's only just over 50%. Now, look, by the standards of any Western politician, 50% approval rating is something that they will be absolutely delighted with. Absolutely, right. But on the other hand, it's an environment where there is no opposition, there is no alternative. And for me, the fascinating thing has always been that we've seen these high approval ratings for Putin, but also relatively low trust ratings. His trust ratings tend to bump in the 30%. And especially in the days of 80% approval, that raised an interesting conundrum. How come? Is it that Russians approve of someone who they think lies to them? What's going on here? And I think part of the answer is that effectively there are two Putins. There is Putin, who's become the avatar, the icon of the country. And therefore being asked, do you approve of Putin, is in some ways being asked, are you a patriot or something? And then there's Putin, the politician, Putin, the person who actually enacts policies on which you could have specific practical opinions. Because the interesting thing is Putin's trust levels tend to map quite closely across to the United Russia Party's also ratings as well. So in other words, the main political bloc supporting him. So in some ways, I think this is it. Putin's approval ratings, they don't really mean that much, but they are absolutely declining. I think we can clearly say that. And in any case, they are artificially high because they just simply represent the fact that Putin has been, after all this, there are many Russians who have not experienced life except under Putin, and therefore he has become this kind of almost symbolic figure as well as actually a human being.
Yeah, but to be devil's advocate, Mark, is it not an illustration of the unwillingness of Russians to resist even a little bit, right? When the Ukrainians were considering altering, I can't remember exactly what it was a year or so ago, they came out despite the risks of being struck by a missile barrage or something to stop that, and the Ukrainian government relented on its intention for that policy change. And so people who, again, are pretty staunchly pro-Ukraine on one side will argue that the lack of willingness of Russia to take these risks shows that they don't have much empathy for their brothers and sisters, if you like, across the border. The two states are very historically intertwined. We know that. So surely their Russian counterparts don't care about their Ukrainians who are being on the receiving end of this war machine. And it shows a certain
points there.
No,
I mean, look, first of all, Russians did protest. I mean, and to a degree still do, but certainly at the beginning, a fair number of Russians did protest. They were dealt with very, very harshly, performatively harshly. And it's all very well saying, oh, well, Ukrainians went out and protested. But again, they did not face the kind of threats that Russian citizens do. Secondly, this idea that sort of Russians aren't showing sufficient empathy for the Ukrainians, it always confuses me, because in a way I feel, well, why do the Ukrainians feel the need to have the empathy of the Russians? The thing is that particularly now that we are seeing an increasing tempo of drone and missile strikes, and inevitably, no matter how you target them, that means that there will be an increasing tempo of civilian casualties. I think the thing is that also is proving problematic, because, and I mean, again, this is very sort of impressionistic, just from the people I speak to still who are over there. You can, on the one hand, be opposed to the war, and at the same time also feel that these attacks make it all the more important that the war end as quickly as possible, and that Russia stop trying to sort of push further into Ukraine. And you can also be angry at the Ukrainians for their strikes which are killing civilians, and in some cases seem to do so in ways that, certainly are regarded as potentially targeted strikes, rather than just a drone hit by electronic warfare and going off course. So I think that we've got to understand that this is inevitably going to be complex. And I know it sounds like I'm therefore kind of excusing Russians not protesting. I just know full well that if I was a Russian in Russia, not with the sort of people who can have the opportunity to flee the country or whatever, I'd be thinking twice and thrice before doing anything that's going to get me truncheoned down and get my family potentially sort of, if I'm lucky, just simply in penury. If I'm unlucky, something worse. This is why people tend not to protest in police states up to that point. And again, this is where, for example, the Prigozhin mutiny was interesting. Up to the point where they think that they can get away with it. Up to the point where they think there's a chance of success. And this is why I think that momentum is going to prove to be very important. And I mentioned the prospect of, let's say, economic pressures pushing people out on the streets. If that is not dispersed, and especially if we see the police and the National Guard either just standing back or maybe even joining the protests, this is the kind of thing we saw in 1989 across, Central East Europe, and then in 1991 in the Soviet Union. Well, then all of a sudden people think, okay, times have changed. And then things could change very, very quickly. But as I say, at the moment, we're not yet there. But all it takes is the right kind of black swan to flutter into a Kremlin tower, and things could happen quite quickly.
Now, one of the things that has been fascinating as well, aside from all of this, is the Shadow Fleet, and whether or not that's a bedrock, one of the cornerstones of or lifelines of the economy as well. But there was an interesting piece that I saw you repost, I think it was on X, a few days ago, which was talking about the theatrical side, the performative side of the British interception or seizure of this tanker. So I would be interested to know a little bit more about what your view is of the whole thing, but also that specific incident. Do you have much confidence in French, British, European, more broadly, efforts to interfere with the Dark Fleet? Or you think these are largely surface level operations right now?
I mean, I think, again, it's neither one thing or the other. I mean, it's worth noting, by the way, whoever decided to call them the Shadow Fleet, that was a massive mistake. It made it sound way cooler than it really is. But in many ways, the Shadow Fleet, it's sometimes framed as if it's some kind of Russian instrument, which it's not. It's actually really a reflection of the workings of the market. There are people who want to buy cheap Russian oil, and the Russians want to sell it. And therefore, there are people who have tankers that will try and find ways of moving that oil. I mean, there's There's big disagreements, but essentially it seems to be that only about a quarter of the Shadow Fleet is actually Russian-owned or Russian-controlled. The rest are all sorts of other different sort of shippers and such like. Now, in that context, therefore, we're talking about the workings of the market, and therefore it's a question of, how do you influence the workings of that market? Taking, for example, the idea of trying to dissuade Shadow Fleet vessels from going through the English Channel. I mean, that will generally add about 4 days and a certain amount of fuel to any sort of journey, which changes the economics and maybe makes it for some shippers less worthwhile, for some customers perhaps less worthwhile. So we're talking about how to change the economics of this particular trade. Now, the thing about what we saw with this one seizure, which was, it's worth noting after all that footage that we saw, that was staged after the event. It wasn't actually contemporaneous footage of those Royal Marines scrambling down there in their kit. Fine. It was, as I understand it, legal under international law because Cameroon had actually withdrawn its flag registration for that ship. So it was unflagged, and therefore it was fair game. A few days later, it's worth noting that the same frigate that fired warning shots at a couple of pensioners in a yacht when they got a bit too close, then escorted Shadow Fleet tankers through the English Channel unmolested. And I think this reminds us that the Russians have options too. They could, for example, flag these vessels themselves, which would mean that they were no longer so susceptible to being boarded as long as they weren't in territorial waters, given the right of innocent passage. They can convoy them. Now, of course, that requires effort. That requires you actually, having your warships out there shuttling along with Shadow Fleet vessels. It probably is not really going to be sort of worth it in the long term. But I think the key point is going to be this. If we want to change the economic calculus, 1 or 2 instances are not going to do the trick, especially when, if we look at the ships that the French and the Belgians boarded, they were impounded for a while, ended up just simply paying a fine that was worth about 10% of the value of the oil on board and allowed on their way. So, I don't think we've quite cracked it yet. And although we like to feel that sanctions are the universal tool against anything, in practice, just simply listing a whole bunch of vessels and saying these are bad vessels, it's a useful first step, but it is not the solution. So this is why I'm sceptical. It's bloody hard to buck the market, and especially so when, in a way, I think too many governments are not thinking of this in economic terms. They're thinking of this essentially in a sort of securitized terms. Whereas actually they just need to think, well, what is it that is going to change the market incentives for these shippers and these customers who otherwise, are making a lot of money shipping that cheap Russian oil?
So then what do we make of Putin's increasing references to Europe? Now, you may think that this is blown out of proportion, but one of the things I've always felt was an important note, at least, was that he looks at the world through great power politics. He's always referencing the US president. He doesn't bother with Zelensky. That's why he's never going to meet him in person, because that would not only demonstrate that sort of Zelensky is his equal, but also that he kind of does recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state, which kind of undermines his entire premise. So the fact that he's acknowledging Europe more, does that not demonstrate to you that Europe does have more autonomy in this, and it's forcing the Kremlin to pay attention to an actor that they didn't used to have to bother with?
Yes, absolutely. And to a large extent, it's precisely because America has bowed out. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One is, look, from Putin's point of view, Europe is a co-belligerent. After all, it's bankrolling, it's arming the Ukrainians. Without the European support, Ukraine could not sustain this war effort, certainly not at this pitch. And therefore, that's why Europe matters, reason number 1. Reason number 2 is, look, however bullish Putin wants to end this war. He wants to end it to his advantage. But nonetheless, he ultimately knows he needs to end this war, and he feels precisely that someone else needs to be involved in forcing the Ukrainians to the table. Remember, he has a bizarre and distorted notion of Ukrainians. Largely he thinks they're not a real people or a real country, but he also regards them as deeply irrational, motivated by some kind of gut level Russophobia rather than anything else. It's amazing what slamming drones into kindergartens does to people's mindsets. And in that context, precisely, he has been looking for who can, as it were, well, as he would think of it, bring some sense to the Ukrainians. And originally he had hopes that it was going to be Donald Trump. Hope more than much faith, but nonetheless, that's not worked out. So I think there is still some sense, bizarrely enough, that the very people who are keeping the war going could, for that very reason, be the ones who could actually bring the Ukrainians to understanding that they need to accept a peace dictated by the Russians. But finally, look, there's a degree to which Putin is, he looks through the world through geopolitics. He also looks through the world through a tremendously egotistical notion of Russia's honor and respect. And he very much sort of associates how people treat him with whether or not they're showing Russia respect. And from his point of view, Europe is not respecting Russia. And that's what I think does also seriously get under his skin. So I think there is a strong emotional dimension here too.
So my penultimate question is related to what was shared by Emmanuel Macron in one of those news appearances he made, I think, on Wednesday, which alluded to the fact that when Trump first was back in office, he assumed that Ukraine would lose. I mean, I don't know why that was such a big revelation, but what I thought was more interesting was the apparent reception a lot of the other G7 members had, apart from Meloni and him saying that she wants to beg. But anyway, good job there, alienating the only person who had any decent relationship with you. But aside from that sort of a lot of people were getting a sense that Trump was more open to the Ukrainian cause than he had been, and skeptical or fed up with Putin's unsurprising, comments of peace, but never actually participating in efforts towards it. Do you think that could be a shift? Do you think Trump could give them access to the Patriots? What would Putin make of that? Or it doesn't make a difference what Trump does at this point?
I suspect that doesn't really make a difference. I mean, absolutely, I think Trump's attitudes are changing. And in part, it's because Trump essentially likes winners. He wants to associate himself with winners. This is one of the reasons why he was so brutal with Zelensky, because precisely he thought that Zelensky didn't have any cards. Mm-hmm. Well, now the situation is rather different, so his attitudes are different. But when it comes down to it, I don't think he's at the point where he's actually willing to put resources into supporting Ukraine. And, you mentioned Patriots. Frankly, this extraordinarily foolish Gulf War has led to such a patriot hunger for the interceptor missiles that restocking American supplies and also the magazines of America's allies in the Gulf, for whom they essentially regard this as a necessary demand for continued sort of willingness to work with Washington, means that actually there's not going to be many patriots around for quite some time to come. So, unfortunately, I just think that's just not going to be feasible. He's not, I think, going to step in and say, well, we're not going to let the Israelis have any, or the UAE.
I don't know. Given what just happened with the Strait of Hormuz now, the Iranians have just closed it again. The Americans look tense. I don't know what the Israelis are, well, I know what they're doing, but I don't know what they're planning, and the relationship to the US. But that aside, I guess, Mark, my final question for you is simply, where does this leave us? There's obviously a growing number of hardliners in the Russian political circles who think that the president should pursue greater efforts like more strikes, more barrages. And then you've got even extreme nationalists who say that obviously we should consider nuclear threats. Again, I don't know if that was how many shots Medvedev had at that point. But what happens now in over the summer, or at least the next few weeks? Do we think, are we going to see heavy responses from Russia, or they're just sort of going to try and damage control what's happened in Moscow and focus on the ground?
It's possible. I mean, we should also note that there is actually, it's always worth finding some optimism at the end, a growing chorus of voices saying, look, we've reached the point of diminishing returns. Let's just stop the war, freeze it now, declare a triumph and move on. And this is something that is increasingly public, in it being articulated in the press by experts. This is nothing that wasn't being said behind closed doors in previous years, but now it's being said publicly. And it's being associated with people like Sergei Kirienko, the first deputy head of the presidential administration, and by no means some kind of maverick voice. If he is allowing this to be said and supporting this perspective, then it's because a green light has been given by the boss that allows there to be some kind of a debate. Now, that doesn't mean for a moment that Putin necessarily is going to be convinced by it. But nonetheless, it is interesting as a sign of the times that there is now can't call it a dove perspective, but a pragmatic perspective against the hawks who say, no, we just have to continue, and victory is just over the horizon, just as it's always been just over the horizon for a long time. The problem is this, that in a way, everyone agrees that the war has to end soon because the damage being done to Russia is too great. So the pragmatists are saying, so just end it, just forget that last 20% of the Donbass. Who needs Slavyansk and so forth? Especially because otherwise, by the time we took it, it would just be a rubbled plain that we'd have to rebuild anyway. There's also a hawk escalation perspective, though, that says, yeah, you're right, we can't let this war continue. We need to end it soon. And the way to end it soon is to go in harder. That maybe we do need to have another mobilization wave, however politically unpopular that is. Maybe we need to send in conscripts. Remember, there's about 150,000 conscripts they could send in who up to now have not been sent in because, again, it would be politically massively disruptive. But the point is, if you want to suddenly turn on the tap and have extra troops, you've got them. Or, again, I don't think we're going to go to the level of the use of tactical nuclear weapons. But nonetheless, there are escalatory options at Putin's disposal. And they might say, look, this is going to be incredibly unpopular and disruptive, but better to have a few months of unpopularity and impose an end to the war on our terms, and then we can move on. So I think we're in an interesting and problematic juncture, is that I think everyone is beginning to accept that this war cannot be allowed to roll on indefinitely. The question is whether the answer is to stop the war or to escalate the war.
Right. Well, you've just got bonus question time then. What does that mean? 2026 mark, 2027? And regardless of time frame, I mean, what does this do to Russia's reputation on the world stage? Putin did this war. He wanted to ensure the resurgence of Russia as a great power, as one of the big three in the eyes of some. And all it seems to be doing, at least to people who aren't just on the payroll or something, seeing it undermine. Or you don't think ultimately that the implications of this will affect Russia too much, that it can reclaim its place as a relevant power because of its influence on, I don't know, its Security Council for what it's worth, or through other methods of energy policy or something?
No, I mean, I think it's catastrophic for Russia in the wider context and in the longer term. And again, this is one of the tragic ironies, that precisely Putin was so determined that he was going to be the leader who lifted Russia up off its knees. And he's presiding over, all in the name of this futile imperial war, he's presiding over the serious disintegration, frankly, of Russia's positions. I mean, yes, it still has people who are willing to deal with it on the world stage for the most pragmatic and transactional of reasons. But where's its soft power? Where is its old hegemonic position within Central Asia or the South Caucasus? You've got Tokayev in Kazakhstan, a man who really, in many ways, owes his position to Putin and the intervention of Russian-led forces during a sort of a crisis in January 2022. But nonetheless, Tokayev is also willing to actually speak out against this war. In South Caucasus, I mean, frankly, Turkey is increasingly the sort of dominant hegemon. And even Armenia, which is smarting because the Russians basically abandoned it in the face of Azerbaijan's attack and what is essentially ethnic cleansing within Nagorno-Karabakh, are therefore thinking, well, we can't trust the Russians, so we're going to have to make some kind of a deal with the Azeris, and more to the point with the Turks. Let alone what's happened in Venezuela, what might happen in Cuba, the continuing travails and sort of limited successes of their activities in Africa. Basically, Russia will retain, Russia is not going anywhere. It's not going to fragment. It's still a nuclear power. For the moment, it still has its permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It has a kind of perverse capacity to be influential by causing mischief, and we can't get away from the fact that actually being a troublemaker does give you some options. But really, in terms of that kind of great power status that Putin felt was Russia's historic right, and that he was the guy who was going to bring it back, well, no. I think when the historians write their books, they're going to be very savage in their interpretation of Putin's reign.
Mm-hmm. Savage, catastrophic. We got some superlatives of you eventually, Mark. But thank you so much for your time. It's an absolute pleasure. Mark Galeotti, everyone, Executive Director of Mayak Intelligence, and preeminent voice, I think, in a very calm and rational interpretation, given all the sensationalism that we see. But if you enjoyed the conversation, of course, do like the video, subscribe, and check out Mark's work as well at The Spectator and elsewhere. And we'll see you all very soon. Take care.